This is the Digging for Truth podcast, presented by the Associates for Biblical Research, demonstrating the historical reliability of the Bible through archaeological and biblical research.
Welcome to Digging for Truth. Henry Smith is here along with Bryan Windle. He's the pastor of Island Bible Chapel in Canada and runs the Bible Archaeology Report at BibleArchaeologyReport.com. So Bryan, welcome back to another podcast of another one of your top 10 lists. So what top 10 things are you going to be discussing with us today?
Well, thanks for having me back. It is the top 10 list of archaeological discoveries related to the New Testament.
Okay.
I had originally just set out to do a top 10 list for the Bible, but there just are so many good discoveries that I had to break it into two lists. So we did the Old Testament list. Now we're going to do a list of top 10 discoveries related to the New Testament. And just to review the criteria I used for choosing these 10 things. First of all, it must be directly related to biblical people or people groups, places, or events, or related to the composition of the Bible itself. And one final note I should make before we begin, I'm really focusing on the discoveries and inscriptions that are largely accepted as authentic in the academic world, and I'm avoiding ones that are highly debatable. So the location of the tomb of Jesus, I think there's good evidence for that, but there is some debate there, maybe more so surrounding the James ossuary, although I do have a blog on that, and certainly the Shroud of Turin. And so I have my own views of those, but I'm going to leave those off the list and just stick with the ones that are generally accepted as authentic.
All right, cool. So let's start us off with the number 10 on your list.
All right, number 10 are the Sergius Paulus inscriptions. In Acts 13, we read of Saul and Barnabas setting off on a missionary journey, and they arrive at the island of Cyprus, and they make their way to Paphos, which is on the western end, and they meet the proconsul, Sergius Paulus. They lead him to faith in Christ, and Luke describes him as a man of intelligence, Acts 13:7. And so there are a number of inscriptions that have been discovered that name the Sergius Paulus family. Now, Romans had 3 names, and we have the last 2, Sergius Paulus. We don't know which Sergius Paulus it was, but there was an inscription discovered in 1877 on Cyprus, a place called Soli, and it's not far from Paphos. It dates to around AD 54. The first publication dated it to then, and it just simply references the proconsul Paulus. And Hogarth, who was one of the early scholars who dated it to the middle of the 1st century. A little later, another scholar named Mitford wrote that on epigraphic grounds, this inscription, while it cannot be earlier than this, is probably considerably later. And so depending on which date is correct, it may refer to Sergius Paulus or maybe one of his descendants. But what it does do is it does connect the Pauli family to the island of Cyprus. And then we have these multiple inscriptions at Pisidian Antioch, at least 2 of which name an L. Sergius Paulus. Now, there were only a limited number of first names, and so L almost certainly refers to Lucius Sergius Paulus, because that was the L name in the Roman Empire at the time. And so we have this at Pisidian Antioch. Now, interesting, where do Paul and Silas go immediately after leaving Cyprus? They make their way to Pisidian Antioch. And scholars have suggested that that is where the Sergius Paulus family estate was. And maybe Sergius Paulus, when he became a follower of Jesus, asked Paul and Silas to go and share the gospel with his family too. And so there is a possible connection there. Personally, I think the inscription that maybe is the most important for attesting to Sergius Paulus is what I've called the Tiber River inscription. It's a boundary stone that was set up by a group of commissioners of the Tiber River. And what's important about this inscription is that it can be dated pretty tightly, pretty narrowly to just within a few years of when we believe Sergius Paulus was the proconsul on Cyprus. And the other interesting thing about this particular inscription, it names a whole bunch of men. It names a number of men who were appointed to this position of commissioner by the Emperor Claudius. And one of the people on that inscription, the very first one named, Paulus Fabius Persicus, went on to become the proconsul of another region. And so that's important because it shows us the trajectory of a Roman, there was a set of roles that men in the Roman Empire would work their way up the ladder, so to speak. And so it shows that just below proconsul was indeed this role of commissioner. And so we certainly have that. All of the men who are listed on there came from very famous families, as it appears that Sergius Paulus did. And so all of this, I think, points perhaps to the very person in question. Bible scholar Ben Witherington wrote, given what we know about Roman career patterns at the time, it is quite feasible that the curator of the Tiber River might have before or after his curatorship served as proconsul of Cyprus. Here's the bottom line. You read about this very famous person who is very intelligent, who was the proconsul of Cyprus. And then we have all of these inscriptions talking about El Sergius Paulus, El Sergius Paulus, El Sergius Paulus. And it's doubtful that there would be two men at that time in the same family who would be filling these important type of roles. So I believe that this is good evidence of Sergius Paulus, the proconsul of Cyprus.
That's great stuff, Brian. You know, this reminds me of probably 100 years ago, a little longer, maybe a little shorter than that.
You're over 100 years old? You remembering?
You look good for your age,
I feel
Henry.
like it. One of the prevailing consensuses in New Testament scholarship was that the book of Acts was written in the 2nd century. Now, today that sounds, sort of like old hat, like, well, yeah, we don't believe that anymore. But that was the prevailing viewpoint. And so there's a couple thoughts about that. One is that's a lesson for the church. The prevailing viewpoint often changes. And now the evidence shows, here just with this one name from Acts 13, requires a contemporary witness. Witherington says, given what we know about Roman career patterns, that's a very specific kind of historical information that only a person writing contemporaneously could know about. But I think the bigger lesson for us is what I said before, is what paradigms are operating now that everybody, quote unquote, thinks is the way that things are, that 50, 60, 75 years from now, when we're gone, is going to be old hat, just like a 2nd century AD Acts authorship is. So I think if you're out there, you're listening, and you're thinking, what does this mean from a big picture standpoint? Think of it that way. The prevailing paradigm changes a lot of times. And so I think that's one of the lessons that comes out of it. And I'm really glad you've done the research on this, Brian. I think it just drives home the point, and the details matter too. You've gotten into the details, and it's just a great job on your part.
Thanks.
Oh, fascinating. All right, number 9.
All right, number 9 is the Pool of Siloam. In John chapter 9, Jesus heals a blind man by making a mud poultice and applying it to his eyes, and then telling him to go wash in the Pool of Siloam. And visitors to Jerusalem have been visiting for a long time this 5th century Byzantine Pool of Siloam that had been built by an empress to commemorate the miracle there. The Byzantine pool is at the end of the Hezekiah's tunnel, the aqueduct that brings water from the Gihon spring into the city. But the exact location of the Pool of Siloam from Jesus' day remained a mystery until it was discovered in 2004. That summer, repairs were being made to a drainage system. And when they were making repairs, they unearthed 2 ancient steps. And so what usually happens in Israel when you're doing construction work and you come across something ancient, all construction stops. They call in archaeologists. And when they called them in, they were able to excavate part of the pool, 20 steps leading down from the street level into the pool. Pottery from one end was used to date it to the 1st century. And at the other end, a large wall and section of the pool dating the Old Testament period was discovered. Now, here's the thing. Scholars had known that the Byzantine Pool of Siloam was not the Pool of Siloam from Jesus' day, and they estimated whereabouts it would be, and that's exactly where they found the Pool of Siloam. And so they believe that this is actually the pool that was the pool where the blind man washed to receive his healing when Jesus healed him, as described in John chapter 9.
Wow, cool.
I'm going to borrow from our brother Gary Byers here, so no originality with this thought, but it's so good that I want to share it. He has talked about this several times where the man appears to be up on the Temple Mount, probably near the Mikvahot, the ritual cleansing pools before you go into the temple complex. It looks like from the narrative he's up on the Temple Mount, and yet Jesus doesn't tell him to wash himself there. He makes him walk like a quarter to a third of a mile downhill as a blind man down to the Pool of Siloam. And I've always found this so extraordinary how archaeology sort of brings this out, something that's not really there in the text. And when you see that, talk about a walk of faith. What is this guy doing putting all this mud on my face, right? And he wants me to go wash in a Pool of Siloam.
Yeah.
I maybe he was grumbling along the way. I don't know, but he did do what Jesus said and he was healed. And it really is an extraordinary walk of faith. And again, I give full credit to our brother Gary Byers for that observation. But for those who haven't heard it before, it's just a wonderful picture of faith.
Mm-hmm. I should note that the Pool of Siloam is currently being excavated, the entire pool. And there is a little controversy around that. And I've only seen pictures and some videos, but it seems that they're using a lot of heavy equipment to move a lot of dirt, and that just does not seem to be the way archaeology should be done. And so there are some concerns that I would have looking at the pictures of how it's being done. I'm not there. I don't know the whole story, but I guess I will say this. They are excavating, trying to get the entire pool area unearthed. And so maybe more discoveries will be coming and more information on that in the future. But I thought I would mention that because that's kind of breaking news from just this past year.
Yeah, I think a good point there, Brian, is us using caution. It doesn't look good, but we only have a small piece of information, and pictures certainly don't tell the whole story. So I think it's a lesson just for us to be careful. Hopefully, we'll find out that maybe more care is being taken than what we've seen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
All right, what's next?
All right, number 8 is the Erastus inscription. So when the Apostle Paul wrote his letter to the Romans from Corinth, he sent greetings from Erastus, the city treasurer. And the Greek word for treasurer is oikonomos, which means manager or steward. It's a general term that could be applied to both the high-ranking city official or a slave who held the role of steward in a household. And it's likely a term that the Apostle Paul used to describe Erastus's job, the job that he did, rather than his official title. And we say that because in 1929, archaeologists excavating at Corinth, they discovered an inscription on a large paving stone near the theater. It dates to the middle of the 1st century AD, and it reads, Erastus, in return for his aedileship, laid this pavement as his own expense. And it's a large inscription. Like the letters are 7 inches high. And these letters are hollow now, but they would have been filled with bronze at one time. Now, an aedile was an elected official who maintained public buildings, kept the streets in good order, oversaw the market, managed the local games even, the Isthmian games that were held in Corinth every 2 years. So while the two terms, aedile and oikonomos, aren't exactly equivalent terms, the term oikonomos could describe the work that an aedile would do. And so many scholars would look at this and they believe that the Erastus that the Apostle Paul mentioned when he wrote his letter to the Romans from Corinth was likely this Corinthian official who laid the paving stone at his own expense.
Fits very nicely, Brian. I think the general consensus is that 1 Corinthians was possibly Paul's first book that he wrote or close to it. The date usually 55, around that time, is the sort of consensus view. I'm pretty sure. So boy, doesn't that fit right in the wheelhouse, huh?
That's right. That's right. And that's one of the things we look for when we look at inscriptions. In fact, it's one of the things that we want to see in terms of authenticity is this around the time, and if we're going to try and make an identification with an inscription with a certain person, is it around the time frame from when it should be? And in this case, it's bang on.
Cool. Well, I see what you have here for number 7, and I got to admit, I'm a little excited because I think this one's really interesting. Well, so tell us about it.
Yeah, so this is, number 7 is the Caiaphas ossuary. And anytime an artifact, and more than the artifact, the earthly remains of an individual named in Scripture are discovered, that's an important discovery. So first of all, let's talk about an ossuary before we talk about the discovery. An ossuary is a bone box, usually a limestone box. What they would do when a person would die is they would lay them out in the tomb. Their body would decompose. About a year later, they would gather the bones, and they would store the bones of people in these bone boxes, sometimes multiple people from the same family in these bone boxes or ossuaries. And in 1990, there was a construction team that was building a water park near Jerusalem, and their bulldozer plowed through the roof of a first century tomb. And the archaeologists were called in, and they discovered a number of these ossuaries, including one that was very ornate and that was inscribed with the name Joseph, son of Caiaphas. And inside were the bones of 6 people, including those of a 60-year-old man, which scholars believe are the remains of Caiaphas himself. Now, Caiaphas, in the New Testament, was the high priest who presided over the trial of Jesus, according to the Gospels. The ancient historian Josephus adds another detail. He records that Caiaphas's full name was Joseph Caiaphas, and that he held this role from about AD 18 to 36 when we figure out Josephus's chronology. And it appears that he was widely known by his surname only. His family name is Caiaphas, in the same way that the sons of Herod were simply known as Herod. And now, many scholars are convinced that this is the ossuary, the bone box of the high priest who played such a prominent role in the trial of Jesus, and moreover, that his physical remains are in there, that we actually have the bones of Caiaphas himself. And this ossuary, you can see pictures of it online. It is on display in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Very important artifact from the first century.
Boy, that's dripping with poetic irony, isn't it, Brian? I mean, here we have what you would call the lead conspirator, the head of the the representative head, if you will. I don't know, maybe akin to Adam a little bit, leading the charge to crucify their own Messiah. And archaeologists find his bones, and yet the Messiah that was crucified, there's no bones to find.
Exactly.
I mean, it's extraordinary. And it's interesting too, as I understand it, there's really little dispute about the authenticity of this artifact, the fact that it's Caiaphas. The Caiaphas is not just some random dude, but actually the high priest. As I understand it, there's not much of a dispute about it, which is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, there's not much of a dispute because of the name, but not just because of the name, the dating of it, and the fact that it's very ornate. Most ossuaries are pretty plain. They're just kind of plain limestone bone boxes that have, an inscription on them sometimes. But this one is highly ornate in the way it was constructed, the way it was carved, and was clearly made for someone who was an important person, a person of means. And so that's one of the reasons they think as well that it belongs to Caiaphas, the high priest.
Well, amen to that. So our next discovery is number 6.
Hold on, sorry. I have follow-up questions.
Oh, excuse me.
All right,
I got ahead
good.
of myself. Go ahead, sir.
No, it's okay, because I may have to cut them out later because I'm not entirely sure about them. I'm just doing from memory. One thing, is it true, did they find nails in this ossuary?
Yeah, Scott Stripling has talked about that a little known fact of this is that there were nails found within the ossuary as well, that people would sometimes put objects in with this as well that were important, which of course raises a whole slew of possibilities on that particular side, as well as the person who led the charge to have Jesus crucified.
And the other thing is that, and here's when I reserve the right to cut this out later because I was listening to another podcast, and they were talking about this in the New Testament where Jesus is talking in Luke chapter 9, I just looked it up, where he says to the guy who wants to follow him, or Jesus is telling him to follow him, and he says, well, hold on, I got to take care of something. And Jesus goes, let the dead bury the dead. Follow me now. And this other podcast was wondering if during this practice of when they would put the bones of the decomposed body into the ossuary, they die, they bury them, and then they come back a year later on the anniversary, and then they do this, or the kind of, not ceremony per se, but then they take the bones and they put them, and they rebury it in a way. So he was wondering if when Jesus is saying this, it's because the man is there to take care of this guy who's already dead. And Jesus is going, no, hey, let the dead bury themselves. They're already dead. Follow me now. So do you have any thoughts on that? Because I thought that was really interesting because it correlates directly to this practice of ossuaries from what he was thinking.
Yeah, I've never thought of that before. I'd have to think about that some more. That's an interesting thought. What's interesting about ossuaries is that they were really only used for a period of about 100 years. And so anytime you find an ossuary, you can date it pretty narrowly to within about a 100-year period, which of course is within the time frame of the Gospels. And so that would be an interesting thing to investigate more.
Yeah, I think that's worthy of investigation because the text seems, the narrative seems a bit jarring because the man says, let me go bury my father. And Jesus says, let the dead bury their own dead. And on the surface, it looks radically insensitive. You know, the man's father just died, or at least that's what it looks like.
Yeah.
Now, I suppose it still could be the case following Jesus is still even more important than that. And that is true. But one wonders if perhaps the secondary burial was what was in view, more of a ritual kind of thing, not the fact that the man's father had just died. So I think that's worthy of exploring. I wouldn't make the argument that that's what the text is telling us, but it could be.
Yeah.
And it's interesting.
It sure would make Jesus look less sensitive or more sensitive to the fact,
Yes.
that so if someone did actually die in that moment, give him a day and then follow. But anyway, yeah, I don't know enough about it. I found that to be really interesting, especially if you extrapolate a little bit of this practice of using ossuaries. I thought that could be really interesting if that's the case.
Well, and Jesus often would say things that had a much deeper meaning, right? How many times did the disciples, they're going across and Jesus talks about the leaven and they're like, oh man, is he mad because we didn't bring bread? And Jesus is like, oh, you're not even getting what I'm saying, right? And so, Jesus could be alluding to something like that, but even having maybe even a deeper level where he's talking about, look, if you want to find life, come follow me. Let those who are spiritually dead just look after those who are only focused on the physical. The dying, they'll bury the dead. But if you want life, come follow me. And because Jesus often talked about physical things, but with spiritual meaning and depth to them. So could be that too.
Cool, interesting stuff. All right, now moving on for real. What's next on your list?
All right, number 6. The temple inscriptions, and I'm gonna include a couple of them here together. Here's the thing: if you read the Gospels, you see that Jesus and the early church spent a lot of time at the temple in Jerusalem, and so any discoveries related to the temple are really, really important. And 2 particular ones are of real importance. The first is a temple warning inscription. So within the temple complex, there was a court called the Court of the Gentiles. It was a courtyard that was the closest area that the Gentiles and the ritually impure people could get to the temple itself. They couldn't go any further than that. And between this court and the inner courts of the temple precinct was a wall. And Josephus describes this wall in detail. And he says that on the wall were signs in both Greek and Latin that forbade the foreigners from going beyond that point on the pain of death. And in 1871, a limestone slab with a 7-line warning inscription was discovered, the very one described by Josephus. And it reads, "No foreigner is to enter within the railing and enclosure around the temple, and whoever is caught will be responsible to himself for his subsequent death." Now, here's the thing to think about. How many times did Jesus and his disciples walk past those warning signs? The temple warning inscriptions were there, and Jesus, of course, would go into the temple. It was a big part of the life of a Jewish person in the days of Jesus. But it's interesting, these temple warning inscriptions could also explain, I believe they do, why the Jews were so incensed in the book of Acts when they mistakenly thought that Paul had defiled the temple by bringing Trophimus the Ephesian into the inner courts, because they thought that he had brought them past these warning signs, and this riot took place. And finally, Paul talked about in Ephesians, he wrote about the dividing wall between the Jews and Gentiles that had been torn down in Christ. And likely he's referring to this separating wall that separated the Gentiles, the court of the Gentiles from the inner court of the temple. So just a really interesting inscription that relates directly to the temple that Jesus no doubt would have seen. And the second one is called the trumpeting inscription. In 1968, archaeologist Benjamin Mazar discovered a 3-foot-long stone slab block among the rubble that had been thrown down from the temple courts above during the destruction of the temple. So even today you can go and see all of these large stones that the Roman soldiers in 70 AD threw off the Temple Mount and had landed on this street below. And one of the blocks has this incomplete inscription that says, "To the place of trumpeting." And the block obviously had formed part of a parapet above where the priests would have sounded the trumpets, and Josephus describes how they sounded the trumpets at various times through the day. And so these two inscriptions are the clearest archaeological evidence we have that testify to the Second Temple, and the closest that we can get to seeing the actual things from the temple that Jesus would have seen as he went to worship there in the first century.
Brian, I was thinking of the first discovery here of the Gentile prohibition, the irony of Jesus walking past those, right? The one that would bring salvation to the Gentiles. And such a tragedy it is that the covenant people of God had gotten to the point where they became so parochial that they couldn't read their own text, like the promise to Abraham in Genesis is clear that what God is promising him goes well beyond any ethnic categories or just the immediate covenant people that would come through his descendants. And the book, references in the book of Isaiah too, right? I mean, seems kind of obvious to us, but it does show you the warning of becoming spiritually blind to that which God has clearly revealed. So the juxtaposition there is very tragic.
Yeah, for sure. I should also note with these discoveries from the Temple Mount area, there is, if you do any reading online, particularly of bloggers from North America, particularly those who are heavily invested in the area of prophecy, there are some who suggest that the Temple Mount was not the true location of the temple. And I should just note that there is no, as our archaeologist friend Scott Stripling says, there's no archaeologist who thinks that the temple was anywhere other than the Temple Mount. Armchair people in North America can come up with theories about maybe it was in the Kidron Valley or further south, but the evidence that we have, the archaeological evidence that we have, is that this is indeed the place. The Temple Mount is indeed the place where the temple stood, where Jesus visited numerous times while he was here on earth.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Brian. We would point people to, we did a 3-part TV episode with Dr. Stripling to cover this problem. It's ironic because archaeologists, as Scott says, where there's 2 archaeologists, there's 3 opinions.
Yeah.
The location of the Temple Mount is the only issue that there's a complete consensus on by archaeologists. And yet North American evangelicals want to say that they're wrong. They finally all got it right.
Yeah.
And then we have this movement that wants to change that. It's I don't know, dripping with some irony. But in all seriousness, we do critique those ideas, and we do believe those are not good arguments. And we got lots of material about that. So I'm glad you brought that up.
I would also point our listeners to a great resource from Lane Rittmeyer. Lane is probably the world's leading authority on the temple, the architecture of the Temple Mount, and he has a fantastic book called The Quest, and I believe it's for sale on ABR's website, and so it's just a great resource. And he's done numerous blogs on his website demonstrating that the Temple Mount was indeed the location of the temple.
I'd love to talk more about the temple, but we need to move on. I have lots of questions, and I still like to learn about it, but we'll save that for another time. So now we're moving into the top 5, Bryan. So what's first on your list of the top 5?
All right, the number 5 is the Nazareth inscription. So in 1878, man acquired this marble slab bearing a Greek inscription from Nazareth. And when he died, his collection was acquired by the Paris National Library, where it was rediscovered. And in 1930, it was finally translated and published by a French scholar, and it caused considerable excitement in the academic community. And so this Nazareth inscription, as it's come to be known, is an edict of Caesar. It likely dates to the reign of Claudius, so 41 to 54 AD. And it imposes a death penalty in Israel for anyone caught removing bodies from family tombs, specifically sepulchre sealing tombs, such as the one that Jesus was buried in. A study of the wording of the inscriptions has led scholars to conclude that this was directed specifically at the Jewish community. Now, this is extraordinary when you think about it. What would cause Caesar to feel that he would need to make such a pronouncement in the first place? Something extraordinary must have happened. See, it was common enough in antiquity for grave robbers to plunder tombs. That happened all the time. That happened, think back to ancient Egypt, how many of the tombs of the pharaohs were plundered. But here's the thing. What they stole were the valuables. They didn't steal the bodies. But the Bible records that the Jewish leaders concocted and then deliberately spread the lie that Jesus' disciples stole the body. And we have this inscription now, which seems to match that historical context. The report, no doubt, had reached the ears of the Roman emperor, who would likely have seen this new Christian sect as a dangerous anti-Roman movement. And Dr. Clyde Billington, who's associate professor of ancient history at Northwestern College, he's studied this in depth, and he has concluded that the context of the Nazareth inscription clearly proves that it was written for Jews and not Gentiles, and that it was almost certainly issued by Claudius in response to the story of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And if that is true, that is a stunning artifact that we now have.
Yeah,
Wow.
Bryan, I would point to our listeners to your Bible archaeology report, where you've done a write-up on this. Really nice job talking about this. There are many things to say about it that are very intriguing. One of them is it points back to the age-old problem, not for us, but for those who don't believe, of the empty tomb. It's the age-old problem, because there's only a couple of alternatives, unless you want to go, all aliens and say that a spaceman, took Jesus out of the tomb after he was crucified, or some weird kind of thing like that, which I suppose with some of the ideas that are floating out there, we have that, but it's the same challenge to explain the empty tomb. And again, this interrelates with the preaching of the disciples and their willingness to go to their very deaths. They were utterly convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead. And I've thought ever since the beginning, since I became a Christian, there's just no way to explain their being convinced of that unless that actually was the case. Because how do you convince somebody that a dead man is now alive, who was crucified by the Romans? And so many things to say about the Nazareth inscription, but it always goes back to this problem, apologetic problem for the skeptic, explaining the empty tomb.
I should note with this particular inscription, there was a recent analysis done on it, which caused a little bit of an uproar. They analyzed the marble from the tablet, from the back of the Nazareth inscription. and determined that it likely came from the Greek island of Kos. And so the authors of the study suggested that a different historical context was the background for this particular event. There's all kinds of problems with that, though, historically. And you can see another article that Dr. Clyde Billington pointed out. I have an interview with him on my website where he points out some of the problems there. But here's the thing. There isn't marble in Israel naturally. So the fact that the marble came from Kos is no big deal. Almost all the marble inscriptions from antiquity in Israel came from outside of the country. So the fact that it came from far away doesn't really mean anything to the historical analysis, and it still doesn't address the quite compelling arguments I find that Dr. Billington has put forward to say that this was directed at a Jewish audience based on the language that's used in it. And so I still think, despite the recent analysis, that the best explanation for this context is the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah, why would you want to steal a body? I mean, you have to, so they have to put a public notice that says, don't steal bodies, guys. Like, what other explanations? There just can't be.
It's analogous to the empty tomb problem. Yeah. There's only so many alternatives logically. And then when you throw in what you mentioned is the sepulcher ceiling type of tomb, very specific to Israel. It's not something that was widespread throughout the Roman Empire, which of course you mentioned in your blog and Dr. Billington mentions, and a whole host of other things there. So think about it from the emperor's standpoint. These crazy Christians are turning the Roman Empire upside down by telling everybody that this Galilean preacher rose from the dead after being crucified by Rome. We don't want another sect coming up and saying the same thing again. So let's just put an end to this. And let's threaten the penalty of death for any other nefarious. Doesn't the text say, Brian, with evil or wicked intent?
Yep.
Stealing bodies with wicked intent. So it's not just the act of stealing it, but that you have some kind of agenda behind it, right?
Yep.
Wow, cool. What's next on the list?
All right, we're at number 4. Number 4 is the Gallio inscription, or also known as the Delphi inscription. So in the book of Acts chapter 18, we read about Paul spending a year and a half in Corinth on his second missionary journey. And in Acts 18:2, we read, "But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal." Now, who was this man Gallio? That's what we want to know. Well, he was born Lucius Annaeus Novatus, about 5 BC in Spain. And his father was Seneca the Elder, his brother, the philosopher Seneca the Younger, who became tutor to the future Emperor Nero. So he was from a very famous family. He was adopted by the Roman senator Junius Gallio, and so he changed his name to Lucius Junius Gallio Annaeus, and of course is known primarily as Gallio. He was chosen to serve as the proconsul of Achaia in Greece, and it was in this role that Paul met him in Corinth. And I should note that our knowledge of Gallio doesn't just come from the Bible. He was a very famous official in the first century. His brother, Seneca, described him as a person who could not be swayed by shameless flattery. The poet Statius describes him as being honey-tongued. But the most famous inscription referring to him is this inscription at Delphi. In 1905, there was a French excavation team at Delphi, Greece. They unearthed a group of 4 fragments inscribed in Greek. And over the next few years, 5 more fragments were uncovered. And it turned out to be a copy of a letter from the Emperor Claudius to the city addressing the problem of their sparse population. The inscription was likely attached at one time to the walls of the Temple of Apollo in Delphi. And it's been reconstructed to read Tiberius, Claudius, Caesar, Augustus, Germanus, 12th year of the tribunican power, acclaimed emperor for the 26th time, father of the country, sends greetings. And he mentions in it, my friend and proconsul, L. Junius Gallio. And so this inscription is hugely important because we can actually date it based on the fact that the inscription states Claudius had been acclaimed emperor for the 26th time. So that dates it to 52 AD. So now we know that it was, and generally, proconsuls only served for a year, in some cases 2 years, but we can now pinpoint when the Apostle Paul was in Corinth, because it was at that time that he would have appeared before Gallio. And so what we see from this is that it becomes this fixed marker by which we can date most of the ministry of the Apostle Paul and much of the history of the early church as a consequence. And so we have this kind of chronological anchor thanks to this particular inscription. So hugely important for biblical chronology in the New Testament.
Yeah, Brian, I think you covered it very thoroughly there. I think just one minor point I'll make, and that simply goes back to the point we made earlier about the book of Acts. The historicity, the contemporary eyewitness nature, the middle of the first century, not second century, first century, Henry. Really remarkable. Love it.
Yeah.
All right, what's next?
All right. Number 3 is the Pilate stone. One of the most infamous historical figures in the New Testament, Pontius Pilate. Of course, he was the man who ultimately sentenced Jesus to death. Now, his historicity's never been a doubt. He's mentioned by many ancient writers, Josephus, Tacitus, Philo. So we know he existed, but archaeological evidence for his existence was discovered in 1961. There was a stone inscription that was unearthed in excavations near the amphitheater at Caesarea Maritima. It was a limestone block. It was part of a dedication to Tiberius Caesar from, and this is the part that was exciting, it says Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. So this Pilate stone, as it's come to be known, affirms again the historicity of Pilate. But what's really interesting is that it confirms Pilate's title was prefect and not procurator. When you read the Annals of Tacitus, he calls him the procurator. The gospel writers, of course, just use a general term which means to lead. So a leader, when describing Pontius Pilate, often described as governor, translated as governor. But the Pilate stone confirms that Pilate was indeed the prefect of Judea. Just a few years ago, another artifact was discovered, a ring that came from the Herodian that said bore Pilate's the name Pilate of Pilatus in Latin, and it's another artifact that may have belonged to Pilate, or more than likely someone in Pilate's employ. And so we have these archaeological, tangible things that demonstrate that this was a real historical figure. Who was the man who at one point said, "Behold the man," when he was presenting Jesus to the crowd before he crucified him?
Think about our great episode of Digging for Truth, Brian, that we did, TV show on Pilate, where we show these artifacts, the ring. The ring is something that was found and then sort of like put away in a box somewhere. So another example of going back through archaeological material and finding this ring. I always think of the tragedy of Pilate. You know, men in history face certain moral moments of decision when they have power. And he's sort of representative of how almost always in the human race, when men with power face monumental moral decisions, they make the wrong ones. And just think of the consequence of that decision, not only for the nation, for him personally. And he had been warned, through a dream, through his wife, right? Yep. So it's not like God didn't extend common grace to him in some ways to give him an opportunity. Of course, God takes all this and reverses it and uses it to save his people. But I do think of the ironies of history, because it interests me the way that man operates when he's in power, and the tragedy of Pilate. Not that I think he's a sympathetic figure, but he's a representative figure, I think, in that respect, and therefore a tragic one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's amazing when you think that Jesus was from a human perspective, born in Bethlehem, raised in Nazareth, kind of backwater area, peasant, and yet the people he came in contact with, kings.
Yes.
And governors. You think of these men in power who met the Son of God in person and turned away, handed him over, rejected him. Just the ultimate tragedy of those things that we see in Scripture.
Yeah. May we be like the centurion who had faith, who was the exception rather than what you just described.
I think one of the points that you made here stood out to me. I feel like I hear so often, well, we can't prove that this person existed. There's no archaeological evidence that shows this. And I feel like I heard someone say that, well, before this time, like, well, we can't prove Pilate existed. We don't have any evidence. And it kind of feels like, well, just wait and see. And, they keep finding more things that, oh, now see this? You guys, you're wrong. And then, they move on to something else that doesn't prove. And then that gets, but so I thought that was particularly interesting that, hey, nothing exists. We can't prove that he existed. And then suddenly not only was there this one, and then there's the ring, and then there's some other stuff. So I thought that was interesting.
Coins too.
Coins.
We found coins at our dig at Kerbet El Makadr.
Okay.
Pilot coins.
Wow.
So,
Yep.
And they've been found in other places too, but it's just wait. I tell people, just sit around and wait and see what happens. God will, so many surprises that come, and there'll be so many beyond our lifetime, right, Brian?
Yep. And there's just been too many times in history where we've seen that, right? We talked in the Old Testament episode about David. People say, oh, we don't have any evidence for David. Now we have not one but two inscriptions that refer to the house of David. Belshazzar is another example, right? The king of Babylon, the night that it fell. People, well, we don't have any evidence of that. We only have evidence of his father, Nabonidus. We don't have any evidence. Then, inscriptions come up where Nabonidus says prayers for his son, the crown prince, says that he went off on a trip and left the throne to his son. You just wait and see, and at some point evidence will come up. And at the same time, I think it was Kenneth Kitchen who had the maxim that the evidence of absence isn't always the absence of evidence, or the absence of evidence isn't always the evidence of absence. And so we need to remember that too.
Very good.
All right, coming down to the final couple here. What's the runner-up in your list here?
All right, the runner-up is Papyrus P52. Its full name is the John Rylands Library Papyrus P52. It's a fragment of the Gospel of John. It's a very tiny fragment. It's about 8.9 centimeters by 6 centimeters, but it contains parts of John 18, 31 to 33 on one side and parts of 37 to 38 on the reverse. It's written in Greek, and it has been dated to the 2nd century AD, so maybe between 125, 175, definitely 2nd century. Given that the Apostle John likely wrote his gospel, the gospel that bears his name, sometime late in the 1st century, this means we have a copy that dates to less than 100 years likely after it was written. So it was part of a collection of papyri that Bernard Grenfell purchased in Egypt in 1920. And since it was discovered in Egypt, which is quite a distance from Ephesus, where the gospel was originally written, we see how far the biblical text was being copied and circulated already within a century, already by the end of the 2nd century AD. So here's the thing. To date, I think the number I saw from a few years ago was 5,800 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Some people have suggested it's an astounding 2.6 million pages of biblical text. And while some of these are, like the P52, are small and fragmentary, a lot of manuscripts have multiple pages, have multiple parts to them. And so then when you add to that the manuscripts in Latin and Coptic and Syriac and Aramean, we have tens of thousands of pages. But we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the study of the New Testament documents. No other ancient text can compare with the New Testament when it comes to the sheer volume of manuscripts, nor when we compare the earliest manuscripts to the original, and P52 is the earliest link that we have yet in the chain that connects the Bible we read today to the original manuscripts.
Yeah, this is one of those favorites, right, Brian? Because it's the earliest one, and of course we've got lots of stuff that follows that. I love it. I just one quick thought. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is so we often talk about the doctrine of inspiration, right? That God has inspired the text through the biblical author Moses, Paul, so forth and so on. But this doctrine of preservation is really necessary for us because, well, if God doesn't preserve his word, then how can we obey it? How can we follow Jesus? How can we understand what it is that he requires of us and the truth about himself if indeed it hasn't been preserved? So they work closely together out of theological necessity, really, for the benefit of God's people. And we're so blessed by it. It's unbelievable the age we live in, Brian, where we have all of these manuscripts and people study them, scholars, believers and unbelievers alike, where we could sit down and read our Bibles and just have this full confidence that what we're reading is God speaking to us, of course, through translation, but God's the Lord of language, right? And this discovery here, this papyrus P52, it just points to me to the wondrous care of God in the sovereign rule over history. How in someplace in Egypt, a scholar in 1920 finds this. I don't know if it was on the antiquities market or where it came from exactly, but it doesn't matter, I guess, in some ways because our Lord preserves his word. It's just, I think it's just something that these manuscripts are something for us to be thankful for.
Yeah, and the thing that I find really interesting too is that this isn't the only second century manuscript we have. We have others. And so it's a pretty exciting thing when you consider P52 and then you look at Papyrus 90 and Papyrus 104, Papyrus 98. There are 4 manuscripts that date likely to the 2nd century. In fact, one of the most popular blogs I have on my website is the blog called the 4 Earliest New Testament Manuscripts. I was in touch with the folks from the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts to talk to them about it, and it really is amazing. This is the earliest, but it's not the only one, and that's pretty exciting.
It is.
Okay, down to the number one. What's the number one thing on your list?
All right. The number one find. I don't know. Are you going to be adding drum roll soundtracks to this?
I can add drum roll if you'd like, yeah.
Yeah, we go. Yeah, the number one find related to the New Testament is the heel bone of the crucified man. Obviously, the death and resurrection of the Lord Jesus are the most important events to the Christian faith. Most important events in Scripture. And archaeologically, I think the most important piece of evidence for Roman crucifixion is what has been called the heel bone of the crucified man. And that's just what it's known as. And listen, we know from ancient writers about crucifixions, there's no doubt Josephus, Plautus, Seneca, all wrote about Roman crucifixions. They crucified thousands upon thousands of people throughout the Roman Empire. But the first archaeological evidence of crucifixion from the Roman period, from the 1st century, was found in 1968 when a construction crew with the Israeli Ministry of Housing was working in an area in northeast Jerusalem, and as we've heard with other discoveries, accidentally dug up a tomb. And what they found in the tomb were a number of ossuaries, these bone boxes that we've talked about, including one that contained the bones of an adult male who had been crucified. His name was Yehohanan. That was what was inscribed on the outside of the bone box, and his right heel bone still contained the rusted spike in it from the crucifixion. And an analysis of the heel bone and the nail dated it to the 1st century, and it revealed that it looks like the nail got maybe stuck in a knot or something in the wood, and when they were trying to pull it out, they couldn't get it out of the heel bone, so they left it there intact when they took him down. And the analysis of the heel bone and the nail seemed to indicate that, unlike some of the drawings that we have of crucifixion, Yehohanan was crucified with a leg on either side of the main upright of the cross. Now, the Romans may have crucified people in different ways, so it's not saying that was the only way that it was done, but it was interesting. It also, some anthropologists said that the bones of Yehohanan also bore evidence that his legs may have been broken. Now, it was debatable, but that would be interesting if that was the case as well, because we know from the biblical record that when they came to get the men down off the cross, they broke the legs of the two thieves, but Jesus was already dead, so they didn't break his legs. So this discovery confirms, obviously, the description of crucifixion in the Bible, including nailing of feet and breaking of legs, but I think there's maybe an even more important thing that it does. Some critics have argued that Jesus could not have been buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea because crucified criminals would never have been dignified with a proper burial under the Roman in the Roman Empire. They would say, the critics would have argued that that his body would have been disposed in a mass grave for the condemned. But now we see, with this discovery, that the loved ones of a crucified victim could retrieve the body and prepare it for burial in a family tomb, which is exactly what we see in the New Testament as well. So that was my choice for the number one discovery in biblical archaeology related to the New Testament.
Brian was thinking of the irony of the Roman attitude here. On the one hand, we're going to kill your people, meaning the Jews, in the most brutal fashion that we could possibly conjure up in our evil imaginations. And on the other hand, we're going to let you obey your laws by taking the poor souls down and burying them in the traditional manner which your law requires of you. So, I mean, God restraining the wickedness of the Romans from carrying it out even worse than they already had. But it is an interesting thing of that's the case, that they did allow that. And to your point here, this mass grave idea has been floating out there for a long time. So, love the way you brought that connection. Think about this poor soul who's been crucified here. This Yohanan, we actually know his name. Mm-hmm. Who knows? Who was he? What did he do? Was he really guilty? Was he not guilty? Maybe in the way that Jesus was not guilty. You know, those are interesting questions. Also reminded me too, I think we put out a news report, I think you wrote this up, of another one that was found in England, but just recently, right? But 3rd century, but still all the way in England. That is pretty fascinating as well.
Yeah, there have only been 3, maybe 4 archaeological discoveries related to crucifixion. The most recent, the one you mentioned, I believe it was just a year or two ago in England, later date, couple centuries later. But because this one is from Israel and from Jerusalem, because this is one that dates to around the time when Jesus was crucified, it just takes on a whole new level of significance.
Yes.
Have you ever seen the movie The Body? Have you ever heard of that? So it came out like 20 years ago, and I actually just recently watched it because it was on one of the streaming services. So it's Antonio Banderas, and it was never a big hit, of course, because it's about Christian stuff. But he is a Jesuit who the Vatican calls him in to investigate. So there was a archaeological. They discovered on this, this tomb that was found underneath a butcher shop or something like that. He was trying to make a basement, and then, of course, they found something. Well, now they got to have an archaeologist come in and look at it. So it turned out to be a tomb, a nice tomb, and there was a body in it, and it had been crucified. So the premise of the movie is, they say they haven't found any evidence ever before of an archaeological, now we have used 3 or 4, but this one you found was in 1968, the original one that you're talking about. So they don't mention that. But the fact that you just don't find bones that prove crucifixion, then you've got this tomb that doesn't appear to have any evidence of Christianity, or it just looks like a crucified body in a rich man's tomb. And the Vatican sent Antonio Banderas to go investigate. And they basically told him we know it's not Jesus, but we need you to do what you need to do to make that happen. And so that's kind of the premise of the movie is this fight over this body because of the implications it could have for the church. And the church will do anything it can. The Catholic Church will do anything it can to save face because we don't want to lose the power. Mm-hmm. But then there's also in Israel, there's these other parts at play where there's the Palestinians that want to take the bones because, they know that the Vatican wants it. And so they want to, in order to get legitimacy for the Palestinian state, they want to have this bargaining chip, we'll give you the bones if you legitimize Palestine. And so it's actually a pretty good movie, and it doesn't make Christians look stupid, with the exception of maybe, the Vatican. But that's one of the things they address in it. Like, at the end, they all start to question their faith. Like, what does it mean if this turns out to be a poor Jew executed in crucifixion and then laid in a rich man's tomb? What does that mean? What does that mean? So It's called The Body. I just
never heard of it.
I just rewatched it, and there's a couple things that I know now about archaeology. Well, that's not how they do that. That's not how they do that. But like the premise of it, like I still think it's a pretty solid movie. And for a Christian movie, it's not overtly Christian, but it is. It's interesting to kind of to wrestle with that. Well, what does that mean if that would happen? And then, so anyway,
good stuff.
Yeah.
So getting back here, Bryan, after you've done the work to compile this whole list, and looking at it kind of broadly, how does it impact you when you're thinking about these things?
Well, I think one of the things I've always found is just how I find archaeology fascinating. I find history fascinating, but there's more than a fascination there as it relates to the Bible. When I was a teenager, I got this Thompson Chain Reference leather-bound Bible, and at the back it had this little wee archaeological supplement in the back. And so I'm a teenager at this time, and at that time in life when many teens are questioning their faith, I found it really helpful to be able to read about something in Scripture, and then so for example, to read about the riot in Ephesus when the Apostle Paul was there, and then to go to the back and to read about the archaeology of Ephesus and see a picture of that theater where that riot took place and see the actual location of an event from Scripture. It confirmed to me the historicity of Scripture. And so I guess the way I would describe it is this: what I've accepted by faith has just been affirmed over and over and over again by archaeology. And so it helps me understand the Bible better, first of all, when I understand the world in which that it was written and the world in which these events took place. But then it also affirms the truthfulness of these events that actually happened to these real people, that it's describing authentic history. The Bible says that Jesus came at just the right moment in time, and that word time is the Greek word for chronological time. At just the right moment in history, just the right point in history, Jesus comes on the scene. And what we see from archaeology is that the description in the Gospels of the life of Jesus is historically accurate. They're not from a later period. They're not mythologizing or making a legend out of someone who may or may not have existed. Jesus existed, and it's really what I accept by faith. I now have evidence for, and so that's very helpful.
Well, that's great.
Yes. Amen.
If you want to see all the things we talked about today, photos and more details, Bryan has this list available at BibleArchaeologyReport.com, and we'll go ahead and stick a link to it in the show notes. That's all we have for today. Until next time.
Digging for Truth is a presentation of the Associates for Biblical Research. To find out more about ABR, just go to BibleArchaeology.org.